Okay, thank you very much for the privilege of participating in this panel discussion this evening. I've been working on the topic of white supremacy for quite some time, and I've done my share of wrestling with regard to what exactly is the relationship of white supremacy to anti-Semitism. And so I'll share my reflections on that question shortly. But I do want to say that there is a distinction between Christian anti-Semitism and what we call racial anti-Semitism. And I think that's an important distinction, even if it's not exactly my focus. And so I'll just say a brief word about the history of Christian anti-Semitism and start off by admitting that there are strands of what could be considered anti-Semitism within New Testament writings. And the early church was engaged in teaching what we call supersessionism, which is a Christian teaching which maintains that since the coming of Christ, the church has taken the place of the Jewish people as God's chosen community, and that God's covenant with the Jews is now over and done. Unfortunately, this idea of supersessionism and the theological roots of anti-Judaism were a significant part of the early church, and particularly as the church began to do more writings as it kind of fought off persecution here and there, that there was a lot of teachings, preachings within the early church fathers that we would consider anti-Jewish. And unfortunately, that was repeated, some would say endlessly, in the medieval Renaissance and Reformation preaching. I lift up the 16th century reformer Martin Luther, who stands out for me because initially in his teachings, he was favorably disposed to Jews, and his idea was, well, if they hear the kind of preaching I think should take place with regard to how salvation is appropriated, once they hear that message, the Jews will convert. To his chagrin, they did not, and Luther was a shift in his posture that accompanied by what I would call rather vile writings with regard to Jews and what should happen to the Jews because of their quote unquote stubbornness, that is so objectionable. It really leads us to pause and think about that. There isn't a straight line between Martin Luther and what happens in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, and I think it's important to say that. Since World War II, the Vatican, with particularly Vatican II, has addressed the ways in which Christianity in some ways contributed or gave theological fuel to the Holocaust, and so there's literature on that. Protestants have also done a similar thing of repentance, and the idea that the church has superseded uh, the Jews as God's chosen people has been thoroughly repudiated, and the Christian church, at least in the academic community, has worked hard to make amends for that. But as I said earlier, my focus has been on racial anti-Semitism. And what we saw in Nazi Germany was an expression of racial anti-Semitism, which the Nazis did not invent. In fact, there is literature to indicate that perceiving Jews as a race emerged during the Enlightened period, and you can see it in such figures as Voltaire. And even with regard to the Spanish Inquisition, you see this racializing of the Jews. So in medieval times, there was this longstanding prejudice against Jews, but you see that now in the modern era being connected with modern ideas of racism. So in the Inquisition, heresy wasn't a matter of unorthodox beliefs, but rather it was about bad genes, Jewish genes, African genes, which were both considered inferior. But it's within the last quarter of the 19th century, with certain technological progress and the increase in scientific knowledge, especially human biology, psychology, genetics, and evolution, that you see some intellectuals and politicians developing a perception of Jews as a race. And this goes beyond the Jews. It's part of a broader racist view of the world and of the alleged superiority of white races over other races. And some of that notion of superiority has come as a result of European colonists and conquerors encountering indigenous populations in the Americas, in Asia, and in Africa. The belief in white superiority would be buttressed as a pseudo science by social Darwinism. It's, for me, Charlottesville. I've been working on racism, anti-Semitism, looking at the African-American enslavement and looking at the Holocaust as well for other reasons. But it was with Charlottesville that became a watershed moment for me. The rally, the fatal rally in 2017. And what we see in the Unite the Right rally, groups that were protesting the removal of Confederate statues, which honored figures of the 19th century who were, in my view, treasonous. And you had people with signs and banners in this context promoting hatred of both Jews and Blacks, even including symbols of terrorism, burning crosses and burning swastikas. and T-shirts extolling the virtues of Adolf Hitler in this context. And I was struck yet again by an overt white supremacist group lifting up as the top villains in their view Blacks and Jews. And so this, led me to really try to sort out, what's going on here. Keeping in mind that white supremacy is a complex phenomenon. It can be divided into overt groups that act out in violence, as we saw in Charlottesville, but it also is expressed covertly, this belief in white superiority that actually covers and corrupts our social order. It permeates systems and structures of our economic, social, and political life together. The overt expressions get a lot of press, and rightly so, but that sort of masks what is continuing to go on with regard to how white supremacy works covertly. So what Charlottesville did for me was to recognize that white supremacy operates as an overarching umbrella under which racial, ethnic, religious groups can be what we call racialized. So this would include, in our context, the US context, anti-Black racism, racial antisemitism, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Asian hostility that's really ratcheted up since COVID, racism against Hispanics, Latinx, which are ethnic groups, not really races, and so on. And so that illustrates that any kind of group can be vulnerable to being racialized. And I have come to the conclusion that racial anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are actually siblings, meaning that they're children of the same father. In the US, which has a long racial a history of hierarchy, racial hierarchy, and the purpose of the racial hierarchy is to determine who gets access to resources and opportunities, protection, advancement, and all the things that help ensure that people have the opportunity to flourish. And so why Jews, why Blacks? I have concluded that Blacks really in this racial hierarchy represent the quintessential non-white. And they occupy the lowest rung of the racial hierarchy. That just is just the way it operates here. Now, the situation with Jews is very complex. The one thing about racialization is a refusal to recognize nuance, differences, shadings, if you will. It just kind of lumps people together regardless of what the reality is. So the situation with Jews is complex, particularly from North America and Europe. Their appearance, some of them, is as white people, but there is a whole diversity with regard to who considers themselves Jewish. But in the mind of overt white supremacists, Jews may look white, but they are not viewed as true whites. They're believed to operate behind the scenes, manipulating the social order, manipulating minorities, especially Blacks who are perceived as not having the smarts to be able to engage in their own self-determination. Jews are seen as controlling events and supporting and assisting those people whom the overt white supremacists view as threatening to them. They control the media and the American political system. I mean, these are all things that unfortunately, I think some of us are familiar with. But Jews are seen or perceived as the ultimate betrayal of white identity in the eyes of white supremacists. And so you have here two groups who represent threats from different points on the racial hierarchy.
Dr. Mitchell, if I can, if we're kind of getting at time, so I was going to see if you could just maybe wrap up and then we'll hand it over to Bob Hornstein.
Yes, thank you. Certainly will.
Yeah.
Yes, glad to do that. There are six characteristics of what racializes a group of people. The perception that their mental capacity is a quality that's inherent in the members of the group. It's a biological thing, which gets passed down from one generation to the other. The differences between groups of people, when they're racialized, these differences are fixed, can't be changed. And again, it's biological. There's the appeal to hair texture, skin color, lots of external things that take on a large issue in terms of defining people on the hierarchy. There is the notion of superiority and inferiority. And what you see missing is any view of that there are people who are classified in this group who are different. So there's an erasure of complexity, diversity across all kinds of lines, including racial, ethnic lines. And invariably, you see the denial of the full humanity of those who are not classified as white. The last thing I would say is it's important that we recognize that racialization takes place of groups, whether they view themselves as a race or not. It's imputed to them, and it happens, or we see it with it happening with Muslims. We can hopefully recognize what's going on and make challenges to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, very much. Now we'll hand over to Bob Hornstein, who I think also may be sharing his screen. So Bob, go ahead.
Thank you, Reverend Jean. And momentarily, I will share my screen. Just thank you to the Episcopal Diocese for this opportunity. This is a really important program. And here's what I want to start with. Listen to the following. Worthless Jews like you should jump off a bridge. Dirty Jew, you should hang yourself from a gas chamber. That may sound like the rants of a neo-Nazi, but in fact, those were verbal attacks made by 7th and 8th graders to a Jewish 6th grader at a local middle school. It has gotten so bad that the family of that child has taken him out of school so that he can finish the year remotely. I wish I could say that that's an exception, but it's not. And we're dealing right now with almost half a dozen schools that have had similar problems. And then there's this, University of California, Santa Cruz. 3 weeks ago on April 20th, you may know that date, that's Hitler's birthday. There was a group of students who celebrated his birthday, sang happy birthday to Hitler, and had a cake decorated with hate symbols. You can't make this stuff up. So as you can see, anti-Semitism is a serious and growing problem. And yet, according to some very recent surveys, at least 1/3 of American adults do not know what anti-Semitism is. 1 out of 6 have said that they have never even heard of the term, which is, by the way, a misnomer. We can get into that later. George Washington University did a study. I believe they surveyed 10,000 13 to 35-year-olds, and a majority did not know what anti-Semitism is. And the question is why? We also know that many professionals that do work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI work, often overlook, ignore, dismiss anti-Semitism as a form of hate. So now I'm going to share my screen and we'll get more into this. So just give me a moment here. And I'm going to start this. Okay. So why? Why is it often overlooked or ignored? First of all, and I think Dr. Mitchell was sort of alluding to this, who are the Jews? I mean, do people really understand who the Jews are? Because the perception and the misconception is that we are perceived as a quote unquote white Jewish community. I call that the Whoopi Goldberg fallacy. You may recall that Whoopi Goldberg, who is on the talk show The View, ABC, was suspended for comments that she made that were offensive to our community. What did she say? Well, she said a lot of things. In fact, she's even doubled down on them recently. But the thing that stuck out the most was when she said that the Holocaust was about white people doing it to white people. That is wrong on so many different levels. First of all, and I use the term white presenting because I have never identified by the color of my skin. And I will tell you that I, like many, many Jews, have never felt part of the white majority in America. So yes, I have white privilege, but I will tell you that the degree of white privilege that Jews have, that Jews who are white presenting, it does not protect them against being victims of anti-Semitism, nor does it explain why over 1/3 of American Jews who have been surveyed say that they are afraid to be openly Jewish in some locations around the country and at some events. So white Jewish community, a white religious community, is a misnomer. And historically, as Dr. Mitchell alluded to, in Europe, Jews were never considered to be white. They were the other. The Nazis regarded us as an inferior Semitic race, not white, and certainly white nationalists or neo-Nazis in America do not regard Jews to be white. And when you consider us only to be a white religious community, and by the way, we were a people before we had the religion, that erases the identity of a not insignificant minority of Jews of color. For example, my wife, who is Persian descent and is decidedly not white skin, she's very much brown skin. There are Jews of every skin color. And the majority of Jews in Israel, by the way, are also people of color. So we know that many Americans don't understand what anti-Semitism is, and as has been alluded to, it's not opposition to the way we worship. It used to be a long time ago, but that's not what it is now. And again, anti-Semitism is a misnomer. What it really means is hatred of Jews. the other problem is that many people don't understand how anti-Semitism works historically. And by that, I mean that we in the Jewish community know about our long history of persecution over the centuries. And I will tell you that there is no community, no city, no country where Jews were able to live that eventually it was a problem. Eventually, it was no longer safe. Eventually, we were scapegoated and considered the other. So think about, for example, the obvious example is Germany, where Jews in the 1920s were very much assimilated into German society. They were disproportionately represented in positions of government, of business, in certain professions like lawyers and doctors. Many German Jewish men had served in the German military during World War I, and yet less than 20 years later, they were sent on boxcars to their deaths. So how is it that someone that looks like me, which is the majority of American Jews, can feel vulnerable? Well, again, it's baked into our DNA, but also the other part of this is that because we are a minority, because we've been historically marginalized, even in this country, yes, our experience is different from Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, and so on. We understand our history and we know what it feels like. Okay, if you only see oppression and bigotry through the lens of race, then it's hard to understand why Jews feel vulnerable, even in the face of rising anti-Semitism. So the Anti-Defamation League, which has been around for decades and addresses hate in all of its forms, did a study over the last 3 years. And here are some of the results, which are alarming. So they looked at 11 different anti-Jewish tropes. And one out of 5 Americans agreed with a majority of those tropes. 85% agreed with at least one of them. 2 out of 5 Americans believe that Jews are more loyal to Israel, our ancestral homeland, than to the country in which we are citizens. Obviously, I'm talking about, in this case, the United States. About 1 out of 4 say Jews have too much power in business, and 1 out of 5 believe that Jews don't care about anyone other than themselves or are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what we want. And I think it was mentioned, I think Reverend Jean mentioned that the ADL also in 2022, their statistics indicate that there were about 3,700 hate incidents, some of which rise to the level of hate crimes, and that was an over 35% increase from the previous year. The FBI does keep hate crime statistics. Unfortunately, we know hate crimes are vastly underreported, and they're very slow to produce these statistics. So the most recent ones are from the 2021, and I also am showing here 2020. And what you see here are religiously motivated hate crimes. The majority are targeting Jews and Jewish institutions. And that has been the trend over the last several years. And what you should notice here is the jump in absolute numbers from 676 to 817. And here are some examples. So here's a local example, right? So this was spray painted on the wall of Congregation Beth Israel. This is our largest synagogue, our largest congregation. Dai Yudin, this person also vandalized the East Side Jewish Commons, and also, by the way, an Islamic center on the East Side. This individual was arrested, but now he's actually going to trial. And then there is the worst attack on Jews in American history, which was 4.5 years ago, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where on our Sabbath, Shabbat, on our Sabbath, a white nationalist walked in and murdered 11 peaceful worshipers. And the question is, why did he choose that synagogue? Well, I'll tell you why. because this congregation, actually this is a more than one congregation, but this synagogue was working with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society to help bring into the country refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war, not Jewish refugees, but Christian and Muslim refugees. And so if you think about, as Dr. Mitchell was talking about Charlottesville, if you remember what those neo-Nazis that were marching, what were they saying? They were chanting, "Jews shall not replace us. Jews shall not replace us." And what they're referring to is this notion that Jews are orchestrating this campaign of bringing into this country people of color, thereby changing the demographics and threatening the white majority, the ideal of a white ethno-state. So the fact that this congregation was working to bring in people of color into our country is the reason why this particular individual, who is now on trial, chose this synagogue as his target. By the way, he pled not guilty. So surely you must be thinking, well, this isn't being mainstreamed on the extreme right, but actually it is. And I'll give you some examples. So you probably recognize this individual, right? This is Kanye West, or Ye, I think he goes by now. Kanye has been very busy on Twitter, making all sorts of anti-Semitic rants and threats to Jews, like you see here. And I heard some people suggest that he's mentally ill and therefore we should ignore him. However, he is a popular cultural figure. He is an influencer, and he has more followers on Twitter than there are Jews on earth. And you never know when someone like this could actually, by his words, incite someone to commit violence against our community. And by the way, and you probably know, he was invited to be a guest of our former president at Mar-a-Lago. QAnon is an insane conspiracy theory that has anti-Semitic undertones, and we can get into that if you'd like. As you can see here, from the last couple of elections, we have members of Congress who believe in this QAnon conspiracy theory. And I love what this New York Times columnist Bret Stephens said, that a nation that can bring itself to believe anything about anything will sooner or later have little trouble believing the worst about Jews. This is our experience from Nazi Germany, where people would believe the worst about Jews, that we were subhuman and worse. Don't know if you recognize this individual. He was also a guest of our former president for dinner. His name is Nick Fuentes. He is a white nationalist. He is a virulent anti-Semite. And as you can see, he blames Jews for being in the way of overturning Roe v. Wade until it was actually done by the Supreme Court last year. He has an organization called the America First Political Action Committee. It had a conference back a year ago in February, and we had 2 members of Congress that were featured speakers at his conference. I would play you this clip, but since I'm speaking to a church group, the language is so vulgar, I will just tell you what he says. He talks about not wanting to have a Jewish-occupied government, a Jewish-occupied media, a Jewish-occupied economy, a Jewish-occupied Hollywood, on and on and on, and that only Christians should be allowed to vote in this country. This individual is a mid-level Foreign Service official by the name of Fritz Berggren. He is still at the State Department. He was there under the Trump administration. He's there under the Biden administration. And yet he moonlights as an anti-Semitic blogger and has an anti-Semitic website called Blood and Faith. Here's an example of what he has posted. Jesus Christ came to save the world from the Jews. They who are the seed of the serpent. Jewish ideas poison people. So these may be extremists, but my point is that it's even on the far right, and yes, there is anti-Semitism also on the extreme left, But what's happening on the far right is that it's slowly seeping into our mainstream, and we cannot allow it to become normalized. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So our final panelist to present will be Rabbi Ariel Stone. So Rabbi Stone.
Good evening. I appreciate being part of this opportunity, although it's not a whole lot of fun to hear about. I want to start by recalling the lives of Aviel Haddad and Benjamin Haddad, no relation, two Jews who were murdered in Durba, Tunisia, a day and a half ago, while they were visiting a synagogue on a Jewish holiday. Possibly because of a common misconception that every Jew is connected to Israel, given the fact that there's been some unpleasantness between Israel and the Palestinians through over the Gaza Strip, between Gaza and Israel in the past week, and given the tension and given the long-term difficulties, it could very well be that the security guard who opened fire and killed other security guards, as well as those two pilgrims, was attempting to make a political statement. One of the ongoing difficulties that Jews everywhere in the world face is that we are expected to be, all of us, representatives of and part and parcel of the state of Israel. The confusion about whether we are a race or a people or a religion or a culture is a fraught conversation. The intersection of white supremacy and anti-Semitism is, the more I think about it, a necessary conversation about the intersection of white supremacy and Christianity. And it must also be said that anti-Semitism is a European thing that was created by Christianity. Anti-Semitism, to me, when I've taught about this, is kind of it's a more of a political phenomenon. I think about early Christian teachings that were negative toward Jews as being more of a hatred of Jews that was religiously created and fueled, and that helped the early Christians to express their separateness and to develop their own sense of who they were. And we know how human beings are. The easiest way to talk about who you are is to talk about how you're better than someone else. And that's a common problem throughout all of history. And it would only be a spat among siblings if it weren't for the Holy Roman Empire, right? Once you get a huge empire on your side, and you have a ready scapegoat exiled from their own home, homeless, stateless, and also other, the Jews are rather like the gypsies at that time, and as the unfortunate peoples of Roma still are. Jews have experienced that sense, and for a long time were the perfect foil and the perfect scapegoat for whatever was going wrong in the lives of people living in Europe. And so there was a kind of an alliance between priests and kings and emperors that you could distract people's attention from what was really wrong by focusing on the Jews who, after all, killed Jesus, which, by the way, is a complaint that makes no sense in a religion that's based on a resurrection. Never mind all the rest of it. So one of the things we deal with in the modern era is that while religions, Christianity in Europe is supplanted by the rise of the modern nation state, people don't change overnight. And so everything we've been learning for 1,000 years may mutate, but it's not going away. And so in the modern era, a lot of people who call themselves secular are nonetheless inheritors of a Christian inflected society and Christian expectations. in the same way that modern Jews who think they're utterly secular tend to use idioms that come from our holy scriptures without even knowing it, it's true in any Western civilization society that has been historically Christian, that even though people may call themselves people of the Renaissance, the social structures that were set up so many years before, so many generations before, are still part of the way we see the world. I traveled once upon a time in Poland with a pilgrimage of survivors of the Holocaust to collect soil from the 6 death camps to be interred in the Holocaust Memorial of Portland, Oregon. And we had an amazing guide who took us from place to place, who was not Jewish, but who was a real Judeophile, probably the black sheep of the family. And he told us some amazing stories. You probably know that in American English, it is no longer okay to say someone gypped me or welched on a bet. In Poland, when someone becomes very frustrated with a situation that's gone wrong, when they throw up their hands in disgust, they say it's the fault of the Jews. And in the same way as gypped me, they probably don't even know what they're saying. But I offer that illustration of just how deeply the sense of who is other and what we expect in our society is ingrained into us. So I want to talk for just a minute about the idea of supersessionism, which I appreciated Dr. Mitchell talking about, has been repudiated. And what's funny about that to me is that it's just like when I try to repudiate something among my people, did they hear me, right? To what extent can we manage to let people know that it really is okay to move on? It really is okay to learn something new. You know, and I think for any of us who are in a position where we are teaching others, it certainly is one thing for us to learn something through scholarship or through experience or through spiritual growth. And it's another to be able to lead the people who we think are listening to us, right? And so I wanted to offer some thoughts about how I experience and my people experience aspects of what I'm, perhaps Dr. Mitchell will agree or disagree with me on the nuance, and I'd be interested to know, is it a form of supersessionism? Is white supremacy in this way a form of supersessionism or an inheritor of it? Because when people, I had a conversation with a pastor friend of mine who's a good friend who couldn't understand why I thought that a Christmas tree was a really important religious symbol for Christians. You know, it's just a tree, really. It's just, why should it be such a big deal for you? You know, that we have one in a space that we're sharing. We just want to have it out for the month of December. You know, it's just such a sweet thing that you know, gee, you know, I appreciate you're my friend. And what's really funny about this is you're a lesbian pastor. So you are not always at the top of the heap. But as a Christian, you cannot understand what it is like. And for you to assume you do understand, for me, that it should not be a big deal for me, right? So that the Portland public school system should decide that a Christmas tree is a secular holiday symbol, and therefore you can have it in the schools. It's a kind of an erasure of the voice of the oppressed. Now, those European Jews of European descent who present as white, are not allowed to be oppressed on the left, right? We are not allowed to be white on the right, and we are not allowed to not be white on the left, because the privilege we have, whether we want it or not, is that it is forced on us in a way that on the right, it's taken away from us whenever it suits the agenda of the right. This conditional whiteness is a fascinating thing, because on neither side is there any room for the nuance that Dr. Mitchell talked about. On neither side is anybody interested in finding out from me how I feel about it. Cultural appropriation is an absolute no-no in the Western world today. We're all extremely aware of it. Nobody would send their kid dressed up as a Native American to a costume party anymore. But for many people who may call themselves Christian or who may be secular but of a Christian background, there's an interest in Jewish symbols. I've seen people wearing a Star of David with a cross inside. I've had some of my people say to me, I've got a Christian friend who wants to know if she can put a mezuzah on her door because it's so pretty. And I'm all, get your own pretty things. You know, I mean, just how impoverished is your faith tradition? Go get your own pretty thing. Bring back incense, you know, whatever it is. When Christians hold a Seder, because that's what Jesus' last meal was, they are committing not only a historic error, because it wasn't a Seder, but secondly, they are consigning all Jews to be historical objects and not a living people. Anybody who thinks that what we do today has anything to do with what any Jew, Jesus or otherwise, did 2,000 years ago is objectifying us and defining us in only as an other and taking away any sense of who we are as a living, breathing, developing other kind of human being. Many, many, many generations of Christian scapegoating of Jews cannot be erased overnight. Many, many, many generations of assumptions. When one is used to not encountering any difficulty in one's assumptions because one is part of a majority, can lead to a certain insensitivity. Even people who are well-intentioned don't really know what they don't know. And so I appreciate an opportunity like this one where we can share information and where we can answer questions. And I especially appreciate that this is happening within a religious environment. It is a sobering thing to face the consequences of power and to realize that you've been on the side of a power that has caused suffering. As white people face Black people, as Christians face Jews, as other kinds of perhaps unwilling or unwitting oppressors come to terms with what we have done, I can only offer the consolation that, at least in my tradition, learning and contrition and acts of atonement are to be accepted and appreciated, and they do heal. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Stone. Thank you all so much. Grateful for your wisdom, your vulnerability, your willingness to share with us this evening. As a reminder, if y'all came in late, or I wonder if this is a portion where we're going to have some questions presented to our panelists. If you do have a question, please send it to Melissa Bird, Dr. Bird, who will be presenting those questions to the panelists. Although Marianne Allison, I saw your question and I forwarded it to Melissa Bird, so don't worry about that. So Melissa, I want to hand it over to you, and if there's a question that you think you would like to start us off with, please do.
Great. Well, I will just step in with thank you all, by the way, for being here. This is really very powerful. So this question is from Marianne Allison. I think for this church, the question of Israel is an elephant in the room. Most Episcopalians are comfortable claiming anti-Zionism is not the same as being anti-Semitic, as is what many liberal Christians and others also say. Many Jews believe that anti-Zionism is a form of racism and should be distinguished from being extremely disappointed with Israel. I would like to know what the Jewish panelists have to say about this. And I'll let whoever wants to answer start.
Happy to start. This is a complex question, and we could probably spend another 2 hours on it. So this is how I would answer it. The question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, I will leave that up to the people on this Zoom call to decide for themselves. What I say, so we have adopted, when I say we, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland has adopted a specific definition of anti-Semitism. It comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism. It's been adopted by 37 countries, including the United States under both the Trump and Biden administrations. It was recommended by the UN Secretary General to urge member countries to adopt it as well. And it makes, in that definition, it makes it very clear, and I agree, that any sort of legitimate criticism of Israel is absolutely not anti-Semitic. Okay, as a Jew, as a professional in the Jewish community, I have criticisms of Israel. I will tell you, if you want to really get into criticisms right now, just go to Israel and watch the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are pouring into the streets every week protesting against the proposed policies of the current Israeli government. So that's off the table. Where then does this anti-Zionism cross over into anti-Semitism? It is in the way that it manifests in terms of exclusion of Jews. For example, in certain social justice circles or on college campuses. And by that, I mean that we have seen example after example after example of Jews wanting to participate in, say, whether it's climate change or it's voting rights or it's reproductive health care, what have you, gun safety, where Jews are told you cannot participate unless you disavow your Zionist identity, your support for Israel. I could give you several examples. We don't have time for that. Or we've seen it on college campuses. For example, the young lady who was a vice president of the student government at USC, until there was an online campaign to impeach her because she identifies, not because she identifies as queer, but because she identifies as Zionist. In other words, someone, in her words, believes in Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. It is the way that this manifests in terms of tactics and objectives that crosses the line into anti-Semitism. So I'll let Rabbi Stone go from there.
Yeah, I would offer just an additional lens. The occupation has to end, right? According to Jewish ethics, you shall not do to someone else what was hateful to you. You know, the Jewish people are the last people who should be oppressing anybody else. The occupation has got to end. Anti-Zionism, if Zionism means the Jews have a right to go home, is, I believe, a form of anti-Semitism, because the way many people are using the term is imprecise. Anti-Zionism is anti-Israel or whatever, but also the idea that you can condemn an entire country for the acts of its elected government. If you're anti-Zionist, then you have to also be anti-US and anti a lot of other places, which you probably are not. Right? So that smells fishy to me, that there's always so much interest over what Israel's doing. Don't get me wrong. I could throttle Bibi Netanyahu. I'm so upset with him. Right? But the 14 prime ministers before him always had a reason why it wasn't time to make peace. And by the way, the Palestinians also always had good reasons why they weren't going to make peace. And then Yitzhak Rabin was murdered because he seriously wanted to try to make peace. It happens in other countries too. So if there's a whole lot of insistence that the Jews in Israel have to be pure, or we condemn all of them as a misbegotten enterprise that has no right to exist, that smells fishy to me.
Thank you so much for your answers. I really appreciate your take on that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
I was going to actually just share a resource that I just encountered. There is a Professor Deanne Jocelyn Simitowski, who's a professor at Boston College, is also an Episcopal priest. And he recently on the Episcopal Church's website posted a video about the use of the term Israel in our Eucharistic prayers, right? So we refer to Israel in our Eucharistic prayers, and there tends to be a fair bit of confusion about what that means. And so I'm not going to be able to do him justice. This is his whole area of work and scholarship, but I would suggest you all check it out, because I understand that there are certain congregations that instead of saying Israel are saying ancient Israel, which again is a misunderstanding of what we mean by Israel when we talk about Israel in our Eucharistic prayers, when we're recognizing the legacy and the prophets that we also draw upon within our worship life. So I just wanted to also suggest that if folks are interested in this topic within the context of our own liturgy and worship, that it's also something that should be talked about. And Israel can mean a lot of things depending on the context, right? And Israel, I think, was the name that Jacob was given. So that's really what we're talking about within the context of our liturgy, but people confuse it with the state of Israel and all sorts of things. So it is definitely, it seems to me, a place where imprecision leads to a lot of misunderstanding and really bad theology and bad politics and bad just treatment of other people. So anyway.
We have
imprecision. Sorry, I was just going to say,
go ahead.
imprecision is a natural result when times change and feelings change and sensibilities change, but we have a liturgy. And I experience that also. When you have a liturgy, you've got something that's conservative by nature.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's very difficult to come to grips with, well, okay, all of a sudden it feels clunky, but what do we do? It feels very strange to change it. So I feel your pain there.
Can I add something? So, I find that when I do presentations on anti-Semitism to non-Jewish audiences, not surprisingly, most people don't really know what Zionism is. So I try to explain what it is. And what I say is that we may think of it as a political movement, which it was starting in the 1800s. It was the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, and that's okay. But it's much more than that. It's really the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in our ancestral homeland. And but it's not just a political movement, it is also part of our religious and cultural identity. And it's been around for centuries, right? And it's in the yearning to return to our ancestral homeland is embedded in our prayers. So it's very much part of who I am. So for example, when I'll use the example, the Presbyterian Church USA, when they put out a booklet that says that Zionism is an evil on par with Nazism, that is denigrating me as a human being. And so, it's very disturbing. It's one thing to be in opposition to certain Israeli policies, but when you believe that even the birth of the modern state of Israel is the sin that Israel has created, that's where it goes too far.
We have a question from Mariah Baker Phones that says, can you please suggest ways for Christians to be more aware of ways in which we and our traditions are anti-Semitic?
I just found out about a subset of the style handbook for journalists. that lists a whole bunch of terms you shouldn't use. And it includes a bunch of terms for Jews and Jewish stuff. Like don't use the word cabal, for example, is in there. So
it's the APA style guide.
there you go.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just found this out from a journalist this past week. I was doing a class on anti-Semitism. It's a big topic lately. So that's a thing. That's one thing. Bob, what do you think? What are some handy ways to know when something's it's interesting. It's like I remember somebody telling me many years ago when I was a kid, we just want you to be a completed Jew.
Yeah.
Right? That person might have meant that in the nicest possible way. So it's really hard to understand what is actually rooted in Jew hatred and in supersessionism when it feels innocuous until you think about how the other person is going to take it. So I would guess that one of the best ways to figure out what's anti-Semitic or what's even just feeling, I mean, the word anti-Semitism feels so full blown to me. What do you think is, what do you think objectifies or otherwise ignores the full humanity of Jews? Right? That's an exercise. It requires empathy. It requires curiosity about the difference of somebody else. And it might be pretty subtle, but I'm sure there are people who make a life out of this. Bob, are there people you know who do this?
Well, I was just going to add, I mean, I think you've covered a lot of it, that don't accuse Jews of being dual loyalists, right? So we're being more loyal to Israel than we are to the country that we live in. Yes, we, according to the Pew study of American Jews, over 80% are in some way emotionally attached to Israel. There's a lot of reasons for that. But to accuse us, and it's happened at the highest levels of our government, to be more loyal to Israel than we are to America is anti-Semitic. And to blame Jews for what is happening in Israel, okay, if there's policies of the Israeli government that you are opposed to, don't blame American Jews for that. Those are the things that come to my mind.
It's really good. Emily asks, how do we stop our intrinsic bias, even if we love that Jesus is Jewish? Can we as Christians do both? How do we show our love appropriately and respectfully? I have a mezuzah, a menorah, and a Hanukkah. Should I get rid of those? How do I show proper acceptance and love when our intentions are good? What's the right thing to say or do? My two very best friends on the planet are Jewish, and I just want to do it as right and respectful, but be myself as well.
I thank the questioner for that question. Jesus would not have had a mezuzah, not in the way we have them. It's like a Seder. Jesus would not have had a Hanukkah. Jesus wouldn't have known about Hanukkah the way we celebrate it. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's appropriate for non-Jews to use Jewish symbols or Jewish holy items, such as those are. And mostly, I mean, if you want to love Jesus, love the historical Jesus, it seems to me, and love his people. I think that's one of the nicest ways. It would be an interesting thing if Christians could figure out how to be good allies to Jews. I think that would be an interesting process, and it would take, like any other form of getting to know the other, it takes getting to know Jews. And here you're going to come up against a curious problem, because a whole lot of Jews don't know anything about Judaism, right? We're just like Christians in that way. A whole bunch of us are not real good at observing. So, to the extent that you're willing to actually do some learning about the difference and honor the difference, there are books for that, and there are people for that. There are classes for that. One of the great ways to learn about Judaism is to take an introduction to Judaism class, which doesn't take much. We have one that's on video on Zoom that the Oregon Board of Rabbis offers twice a year. And in 18 weeks, you yourself can learn an awful lot about how Judaism is not Christianity. There are introduction to Judaism classes all over the United States. And it probably would be a really useful way of gathering good information about that. I just wanted to offer one other thought about what it's like to be a Jew. This happens to me every St. Patty's Day. And Bob, I don't know how you feel about this, but it always cracks me up to look at all the people who pretend to be Irish that day. And it's not a big deal. You know, the river turns green and everybody dyes their hair green and drinks a lot of beer. But the thing that always cracks me up is that a whole lot of people who are Irish and a whole lot of people who aren't wear these buttons that say, "Kiss me, I'm Irish." Mm. Can you imagine a world where Jews would walk around wearing buttons saying, "Kiss me, I'm Jewish," and where non-Jews would wear them too? It is completely ludicrous to Jews that we will ever be centered as the sexy, marginalized minority of the day.
I have to jump in here as a Native American woman and say, I think what you are pointing out is so important about these are religious items. A headdress is a religious item. Feathers are a religious item. White sage is a religious item. It is not for general use. It is very purposeful in its use for many tribes and nations in the United States. I think this is such a critical piece to what we are talking about as far as the cultural appropriation of culture, of religious items. I think it is just a really, and it goes across the board for people of color and for Jewish people. Like, this is a thing. And we do it so often here in this country. We've got many questions flooding in. I hope it's okay for me to move forward because we've got a couple more questions and I'm aware and cognizant of time.
Just a really
go ahead, Bob.
Comment. To me, the key is mutual respect. There are many pathways to God, and I hope that we can respect those. When we see messianic churches that have all the trappings of Judaism and they're preying on vulnerable Jews to try to convert them, that's where this becomes a problem.
Absolutely.
I also would like to just make a plug for the work of Amy Jill Levine. I think I mentioned her before. She's a Jewish New Testament scholar who looks at Jesus within the context of the Judaism in which he lived, right? Which I think is the point. And I have learned so much from her in my own preaching and teaching of that sort of the lack of critical thinking I brought to some tropes that we have in our preaching about the Pharisees and about legalism and about, about purity culture and these things that show up again and again and again within the Christian church.
Even the Good Samaritan.
Absolutely. And these are bad teaching. It's not right. And it also is so easy to just sort of take that and then turn it into, well, Jews are like that, right? And so I think that that piece is really important. So Amy Jill Levine and Dr. Mitchell, I don't know if there's anyone else you could point to, but of people doing really good work in unpacking the way this shows up in Christianity and in the church.
Dr. Mitchell, do you have any resources or anything you want to add to that?
No, I not at this time. But I'm very much interested in this discussion. I feel like kind of like a fly on the wall in one sense, and having the experience of what it is like to hear Jewish people, Jewish leaders say what it is that's troubling and problematic with regard to how they're viewed, how they're seen, et cetera, even down to your example, Ariel, of the celebration of Christmas. I was in at a time where, it was ubiquitous, and even in school districts where there were many, many Jewish children and teachers. And it occurred to me once I left school, what must it have been like to be bombarded with this, with no thought as to how Jewish children, Jewish teachers experienced it. So I feel sort of like a very much experiencing what it is like to hear a minority talk about their experience, and I'm part of the majority in terms of being a Christian. It's invaluable, so I thank you for that.
We have a question from Judy that says, I've been told that anti-Semitism is a misnomer, that what we're really talking about is anti-Jewish, since all Semites are not Jews. Sorry. Is this too fine a point, or might we consider speaking more precisely?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Dr. Mitchell wants to weigh in here, but my understanding is that the term anti-Semitism was developed by a German professor, I think in 1879. And, when you think of Semites, well, Semites refers to people who lived in a certain part of the Middle East, and it included Arabs, not just Jews. So it's really a misnomer. I mean, let's call it for what it is. And I know it sounds callous to call it Jew hatred, but that's what we're talking about. That's all I got.
That's all you got? Okay.
That's all you need.
Mitchell,
That's
I don't know
well
if you
said.
That's all you need.
Well said.
Awesome. Bob has a question about can Bob or Rabbi Stone talk about the impact of historical trauma and how that impacts the Jewish perspective towards anti-Semitism?
Well, go read Maus, M-A-U-S.
Yes.
If you've ever heard of epigenetic trauma, if you understand the idea that trauma can actually make changes in people's DNA or RNA, whichever it is, I think any people that has experienced massacres, pogroms, blood libels, everything else, if a parent learns to be afraid, they teach their child to be afraid. There are really terrible stories that almost pass for funny. The uncle who comes over and is playing with the little child, the little 2-year-old, and the little 2-year-old is laughing and having a great time. And the uncle puts the 2-year-old up on the mantle of the fireplace and reaches his arms out and says, "Jump to me." And the little child jumps without a thought in the world, and the uncle doesn't catch him. And the child crashes to the floor and looks up in tears. And the uncle looks down and says, "Now, don't you never trust nobody." That's a Jewish story. And it's a terrible, tragic story. But I think most Jews of European extraction would completely understand it. I could tell others, but they're even weirder. Again, I remember hearing from an Arab, "I'm a Semite, how I can't possibly be anti-Semitic," right? The word anti-Semitic, there's a reason we took out the hyphen. I mean, people are futzing around trying to figure out the term. It's hatred of Jews. Hatred of Jews. Which is funny in and of itself. Why isn't it racism? Why isn't it, I mean, what is it? It's this curious thing. I like to think that one of the reasons that Jews are targeted is because, at least in the United States, where everything is very color-coded, we insist on the nuance that we are neither white nor black. We disrupt the binary of wanting to shove everybody into one camp or the other. And by the way, that seems to be a problem on both the left and the right. There's no real room for nuance.
No.
Unless you're in the LGBTQIA community where they celebrate nuance. It's very interesting how these things are parceled out with great parsimony as if there just isn't enough love to go around.
If I showed you a map of the communities in Europe, and I'm not even talking about the Middle East because it was happening there as well, but especially in Europe, of the communities in which Jews were at first welcomed and then were expelled or in some other way persecuted. In Spain, in England, in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia. I mean, I can go on and on and on. And so
in Italy, in Romania.
Yeah, and I touched on this, that's why it's baked into our DNA. I've had this discussion with my youngest son, who just turned 20, who doesn't seem to understand that we can never take for granted our continued security even in this country. I mean, we are facing now in this country threats to our democracy. And when there are threats to democracy, that means there are threats to minorities, including to the well-being of the Jewish community. And so we can never take it for granted. And that's why Israel is so important to us, because it's our security card. It's our guarantee. Yeah. I hate to say that, but that's, it may not happen, hopefully, in our lifetimes, but you can never assume that we will be safe and secure 100 years from now in this country.
Jews tend to have current passports. When I meet someone who doesn't have a passport, I don't understand.
Yeah. We have a question from Peter. How important is public education in helping us form an understanding that respects our multicultural reality by honoring the equal dignity of all people, and how important is the movement to exclude histories, books, and texts in public schools?
That's not a question. That's a speech. I believe that it's probably going to be more and more important for faith communities to take leadership, right? If people who hate other people are going to say that's Christian, I think it's really, really important for Christian faith leaders to teach something different. We all believe that the public schools were our safe place where we would all learn to tolerate, if not love each other. But I think we're going to have to talk about that more and more strongly from our faith communities. Y'all can't let Christianity be hijacked.
Education is the first line of defense. That's why this program is so important.
Yeah, and that's why education's under attack in this country.
Not just about the Holocaust, which we helped to write the bill to mandate Holocaust and genocide education. Okay, let's talk about the genocide that occurred on the Atlantic Ocean for 2 million Africans. We can go on about that. We have to be educated. And what we are finding is more and more that students do not understand anything about the Holocaust. They don't understand the history, the real history of this country, which is being erased in certain states that are trying to suggest things like that slavery wasn't really part of the Civil War. I mean, Dr. Mitchell, I'm sure you have a lot to say about that. I mean, that are banning books. And what's next? Burning books? We have to educate. And I would also say it's not just the students, it's also the educators themselves. Because this is what we're finding in the schools that we're now working with, where, and by the way, we may be contacted by a Jewish parent or a Jewish teacher because there's some sort of anti-Semitism going on, but we soon find out it's not just anti-Semitism. There are other issues, racism, anti-gay hate, you name it, right? And what we're finding is that the educators and the administrators seldom know exactly how to handle it. And so we try to offer resources that can help them. And so, education is so critical. I think we all understand that.
Yeah. And I just really, I said it. I said yes really loudly when Reverend Stone said, read Mouse. Our children read Mouse in our house. Like we go through it and then we talk with them and they sob through the whole thing. Like they just can't possibly believe that is a thing, that it is real. And Martha, your question about, can you talk about how to address this with young people? I don't know that we have a ton of time to go through that, but I think the resources that have been mentioned here, but particularly Mouth, is one of the greatest ways to help young people, particularly middle schoolers, understand what what everything we have been talking about tonight. I think it is such a critical book for anybody to read, but particularly young people, because of how well it explains things.
And this brings us around to something that Reverend Jean, you mentioned maybe even before we started about the Dara Horn article in the Atlantic.
Right.
So one of the things that Jews thought we could do to combat Jewish hatred was to simply show people what it leads to. So, you know, we'll build a museum and we'll show you what hate causes. We can testify to this because it happened to us. Let's try to make sure it never happens again for anyone. But what we're learning is that if you invite someone to a museum, they have to have a developed capacity for empathy.
Yes.
One of the biggest problems that leads, I think, to hatred of Jews or anyone is the way our society brutalizes the individual out of being able to consider thoughtfully the feelings of another human being and their reality. And again, I think that churches, synagogues, places of worship have to be bastions of our common teaching to regard the other as you yourself wish to be regarded. Do not do to someone else that which is hateful to you. And that those words have to matter and they have to be carried out in our actions.
And I'm struck by Rabbi Stone with your comment that what does it mean for, and I think this is a fruitful conversation and one I hope that we can continue. What does it mean for Christians to be true allies to Jews? And also the comment that was made that when we talk about the intersection of white supremacy and anti-Semitism, we really are talking about the intersection of Christianity and anti-Semitism, and reckoning with not only our history, but the way it continues to be perpetuated within the church. And so I know we're just about out of time. So I just want to thank Professor Mitchell, Rabbi Stone, and Mr. Bob Hornstein for joining us this evening for such a good conversation. And I appreciate you all spending your Wednesday evening with us, listening, providing thoughtful questions. And I hope that this is a conversation that we can continue because I think it's so important. And I'm just grateful to you all for being here, for sharing your wisdom and your hearts with us. And as, you know, love. Okay, that's where I'll say it. So, you know, someone sent me a message and said, I hope that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. I hope that this is a heart exercise. And I think this is absolutely both. I think we have to understand with our minds the history and the way that this has been wrought through the centuries through our own ancestors and our own forebears in the church, and also shift our hearts around the way that we engage with one another and find empathy and love, in that we're all created in the image of God, and that is a beautiful thing for us to celebrate and connect together through. So thank you all.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you so much for the privilege of being here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, all right. Be well.